The carriage wheels crunched against the frozen gravel drive with a sound like breaking bones, and Lady Catherine Winthrop drew her fur-lined cloak tighter against the January cold that seemed to seep through the very walls of the approaching edifice. Ashmore Hall rose before her like a monument to faded glory, its grey stone facade weathered by centuries of English winters, its windows reflecting the pale afternoon light with all the warmth of polished steel. She had studied her reflection in those same windows during her brief courtship, if one could call 3 formal meetings arranged by solicitors a courtship, and had seen in them the truth she had tried so desperately to ignore. She was not coming here as a bride cherished and chosen, but as a transaction completed, a ledger balanced, a solution to problems spoken of only in hushed tones behind closed doors. The estate grounds stretched endlessly in every direction, barren trees clawing at the colourless sky, the gardens long surrendered to winter's grip, and Catherine thought how fitting it was that she should arrive in this season of death and dormancy to a house that felt as though it had forgotten the very concept of spring. As her carriage drew to a halt before the grand entrance, she caught sight of him, the Duke of Ashmore, standing at the top of the stone steps with the rigid posture of a man facing execution rather than matrimony. Even from this distance, she could see the set of his jaw, the aristocratic angles of his face that might have been handsome had they not been carved from such apparent ice, and the dark coat that hung upon his frame with the precision of duty rather than the ease of comfort. He descended the steps with measured grace as a footman opened her carriage door, and when he offered his hand to assist her descent, his touch was brief, impersonal, the gesture of a man performing an obligation he had paid dearly to assume, or rather, that she had paid dearly for him to assume. For was it not her father's merchant fortune that had purchased this ancient title, this crumbling estate, this man who looked at her now with eyes the colour of a winter sky, and just as welcoming? "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice a low baritone that carried neither warmth nor particular coldness, merely the neutral tone of formal acknowledgement. "Welcome to Ashmore Hall. I trust your journey was not unduly taxing." She murmured something appropriate, watching as her trunks were unloaded, containing her trousseau and her hope, the latter packed more carefully than the former, wrapped in layers of determination that perhaps an arrangement begun in necessity might yet transform into something resembling contentment, if not love. The ceremony itself took place that very evening in the estate's chapel, a small stone building attached to the main house where generations of Ashmore dukes had been christened, married, and mourned. The vicar's words echoed against ancient walls, and Catherine repeated her vows while studying the man beside her, searching for some flicker of emotion in his profile, finding none. When he placed the ring upon her finger, a heavy circle of gold set with diamonds that felt more like a shackle than an adornment, his fingers were cold, and he did not meet her eyes. They were pronounced man and wife as sleet began to tick against the chapel windows, and the Duke, her husband, though the word felt strange and foreign in her mind, pressed a perfunctory kiss to her cheek with all the passion one might display when signing a business contract. As they walked back through the covered passage to the main house, Catherine felt the weight of her new title settling upon her shoulders alongside the weight of understanding. She had become the Duchess of Ashmore, and in exchange for her father's fortune restoring this estate's depleted coffers, she had gained everything a woman of her station could desire, except the one thing that mattered, a husband who had married her for anything other than her money. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now let's begin. Weeks passed in a silence so profound that Catherine began to measure time not by the calendar, but by the hollow echo of her own footsteps, traversing the endless corridors of Ashmore Hall, each room she explored, revealing further evidence of the decay. Her father's money was meant to arrest wallpaper, peeling like skin from ancient walls, furniture draped in cloth like corpses awaiting burial, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to judge her merchant blood as insufficient payment for their descendants' pride. The Duke attended to estate business with a dedication that seemed designed specifically to avoid her presence, appearing only for dinner each evening, where they sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20, making stilted conversation about the weather, the quality of the meal, anything except the yawning chasm between them that no amount of polite discourse could bridge. She tried, in those early weeks, to engage him in discussions of substance, asking about the estate's history, expressing interest in his plans for its restoration, offering observations about improvements that might be made, but each attempt met with the same courteous deflection, his answers brief and formal, his attention already drifting toward whatever ledger or correspondence awaited him in his study, until she learned to remain as silent as he preferred, pushing food around her plate while the candles burned low and the servants moved like ghosts between them. The household staff regarded her with a pity that burned more than any open disdain could have, their kindness somehow emphasizing her isolation rather than alleviating it. Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper, would pat her hand with maternal sympathy when showing her the still room or the linen closets, and young Mary, assigned as her lady's maid, often had tears in her eyes when helping Catherine undress after another silent dinner, as though witnessing a tragedy unfold in slow motion. It was Mary who let slip the true extent of the estate's financial ruin, speaking of creditors who had threatened seizure before Catherine's dowry arrived like salvation, of servants let go and pensions unpaid, of the Duke's father, who had gambled away 3 generations of careful stewardship in a decade of reckless indulgence, leaving his son to inherit nothing but debt and the crushing weight of a title that demanded maintenance of appearances that could no longer be afforded. Catherine discovered the evidence herself when exploring the East Wing, finding rooms stripped of their contents, rectangular shadows on walls where paintings had hung before being sold, empty display cases that once held family silver, and she understood then the full measure of what her money had purchased, not merely a title for herself, but survival for this man who walked these halls like a prisoner serving a sentence he had not deserved. He came to her chamber on precisely 3 occasions during those first weeks, fulfilling the marital duty required to secure the heir that was, after all, the entire purpose of their arrangement. And each visit was conducted with the same painful courtesy that characterized their dinners: a brief knock, a murmured greeting, the necessary intimacy performed with as little actual intimacy as physically possible, and then his departure before the candle on her bedside table had burned down even an inch, leaving her alone in the darkness to wonder if this cold efficiency was to be the sum total of their marriage, if she would spend the rest of her life wandering these empty halls, her footsteps echoing back to her like questions that would never receive answers. A duchess in title, but in truth merely another piece of furniture purchased with her father's merchant, gold, decorative and useful, but ultimately unloved. Spring arrived at Ashmore Hall with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the harshness of winter, crocuses pushing through the thawing earth in delicate clusters of purple and white, and Catherine discovered the change within herself, on a morning when pale sunlight streamed through her chamber windows, and the nausea that had plagued her for a week suddenly clarified into understanding that made her hands tremble as she pressed them against her still flat abdomen. She told no one at first, hugging the knowledge to herself like a precious secret, afraid that speaking it aloud might somehow make it less real, but the truth declared itself soon enough when the physician was summoned and confirmed what her body had already whispered. She was carrying the Duke's child, the heir that was the entire purpose of their arrangement, and she felt a cautious joy blooming in her chest like those crocuses outside, fragile but persistent, rooting itself in soil that had seemed too frozen to sustain any living thing. The Duke received the news in his study, Catherine standing before his desk like a supplicant before a magistrate, and she watched his face carefully as she spoke the words, searching for some flash of happiness or warmth, finding instead what she had learned to expect: satisfaction, and the same expression he might wear upon learning that a difficult negotiation had concluded favorably or that the estate's accounts had balanced for the quarter. "That is excellent news," he said, rising from his chair with the formal courtesy that characterized all his interactions with her. And then, because apparently some acknowledgement of the personal nature of the announcement was required, he added, "You have my gratitude, Catherine, for fulfilling this duty so admirably." Duty, always duty, the word that governed every aspect of their existence together, and she nodded and murmured something appropriate, while that fragile joy in her chest curled inward protectively, and she understood that whatever happiness she found in motherhood would have to be sufficient unto itself, independent of any hope that this child might bridge the chasm between herself and the man who had sired it. She threw herself into preparations with a determination that bordered on desperation, claiming the nursery in the south wing as her province, and overseeing its complete transformation from the dusty abandonment in which she had found it, ordering new wallpaper printed with cheerful pastoral scenes, selecting furniture from catalogues that Mary brought from the village, spending hours embroidering tiny gowns with stitches so small and precise they seemed like prayers worked in thread. The household staff rallied around her preparations with an enthusiasm that felt like balm to her isolation. Mrs. Hendricks contributing family christening gowns from her own children's infancy, the groundskeeper bringing in a wooden cradle he had carved during the long winter evenings, and Catherine found herself crying over these kindnesses from servants who treated her with more genuine affection than her own husband had ever displayed. Yet there were moments, small, indefinable moments, that she hardly dared acknowledge even to herself, when she would look up from her embroidery or her consultations with the carpenter about shelving for the nursery and find the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch before he would notice her, notice and retreat behind that impenetrable wall of formal politeness, leaving her to wonder what thoughts moved behind those winter sky eyes, what judgments or observations, or perhaps even feelings he kept locked away where she could never reach them, and whether the child growing within her might somehow, impossibly, transform this arrangement of convenience into something that resembled the marriage she had once foolishly hoped to find. The Duke began appearing at Catherine's door with an frequency that would have seemed attentive had she not understood its true motivation. His inquiries about her health and comfort delivered in that same formal tone that characterized all their interactions, yet the very fact of his presence, twice daily now, sometimes more, represented such a departure from the studied avoidance of their first months together that Catherine found herself both grateful and guarded. Grateful because the loneliness of those early weeks had been crushing, and any human connection, even one rooted in concern for the heir rather than herself, provided relief from the isolation, yet guarded because she had learned through painful experience not to mistake duty for genuine feeling, not to read warmth into courtesy or care into obligation. He would inquire whether she had rested well, whether the physician had been satisfied with her progress, whether she required anything for her comfort, and she would answer with matching formality that yes, she had slept adequately. Yes, the physician expressed satisfaction. No, she required nothing beyond what had already been provided, and then they would stand in awkward silence until he bowed slightly and took his leave. The entire exchange, conducted with the stilted precision of a diplomatic negotiation, yet even in these brief encounters, Catherine began to notice small details that troubled the careful boundaries she had drawn around her heart, the way his eyes would linger on her face as though searching for some sign of distress she might not verbally acknowledge, the tension in his shoulders that suggested his concern was not entirely the detached interest of a man monitoring a valuable investment, and the half-aborted gesture when she once stumbled slightly on the threshold, his hand moving toward her elbow before he caught himself and resumed his formal posture. She found him in the nursery one evening as April surrendered to May, discovered him standing before the window where the last light gilded the pastoral wallpaper she had so carefully selected, and the shock of finding him in this space she had claimed as peculiarly her own made her pause in the doorway, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of this room with its half-finished embroidery draped over the chair and the tiny gowns laid out on the dressing table for her inspection. "Your Grace," she said, and he turned with an expression she could not quite interpret, something almost vulnerable in his face before the familiar reserve descended like a curtain. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though he made no move to leave, his gaze traveling over the transformations she had wrought in this space, the evidence of her hopes made manifest in fabric and furniture and careful decoration. "I wished to see. That is, I wanted to ensure that everything was adequate." The word hung between them, so insufficient for what surrounded them, and Catherine moved into the room slowly, as one might approach a skittish horse, afraid that any sudden movement might send him fleeing back to the safety of his study and his ledgers. "It is more than adequate," she said quietly, and then, because something in his face invited honesty, added, "It is everything I could wish for our child." She saw him flinch slightly at the possessive pronoun, "our child," as though the words carried weight he had not anticipated, and for a moment something passed between them in that golden light, something that felt almost tender, a recognition that whatever the nature of their arrangement, they were bound together in this creation of new life. But then he cleared his throat, and the moment fractured like glass, and he was bowing again, murmuring something about not disturbing her further, and she was alone once more among the tiny gowns and carefully embroidered hopes, wondering what might have been said if either of them had possessed the courage to speak beyond the confines of duty and propriety that governed their every interaction. Summer arrived with a warmth that transformed Ashmore Hall into something Catherine had not imagined during those frozen months of winter. Honeysuckle, climbing the garden walls, and roses blooming in profusion along the southern terrace, and with the season came subtle changes in the Duke's behavior that she observed with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to trust surface appearances, yet cannot quite suppress the dangerous whisper of hope. He began appearing at her chamber door each morning just after breakfast, dressed for riding but carrying himself with a hesitancy that seemed at odds with his formal bearing, and he would inquire always with that maddening politeness whether she might wish to accompany him on a brief walk through the grounds, claiming with a physician's authority she suspected he had invented that fresh air and gentle exercise were beneficial for the child. And though Catherine recognized these invitations as stemming from his concern for the heir rather than any desire for her company, she found herself accepting because the alternative was another day spent alone, with only her thoughts and her embroidery, and the careful management of hope that threatened constantly to overflow its banks. Their conversations during these walks remained stubbornly superficial, discussions of the weather and the estate's grounds, and the progress of various repair projects he had undertaken, yet the simple fact of his presence beside her, the sound of his voice speaking of mundane things, the occasional brush of his sleeve against hers on the narrow garden paths, these small contacts accumulated like drops of water, slowly filling a vessel Catherine had believed permanently emptied, and she warned herself sternly against reading meaning into courtesies that were nothing more than a man's reasonable concern for the vessel carrying his heir. Yet her treacherous heart refused to heed these warnings. She began noticing other changes that she could not so easily dismiss as duty toward the child books appearing on the table beside her favorite chair in the morning room, volumes of poetry and philosophy that matched interests she had mentioned only once in passing during their stilted dinner conversations, and her favorite foods appearing with increasing frequency at table. Despite her certainty, she had never explicitly stated these preferences. Small observations the Duke must have made and acted upon without announcement or acknowledgement, gestures so subtle she might have imagined them were it not for their accumulation. The household staff had surely noticed these shifts as well, Mrs. Hendricks permitting herself a small smile when Catherine mentioned the books, Mary humming cheerfully as she arranged Catherine's hair, and Catherine wanted to warn them all against hope, to explain that kindness was not love and attention was not affection, yet she could not quite form the words because some part of her, the part she tried desperately to suppress, and wondered whether perhaps these gestures meant something more than duty demanded. The thunderstorm arrived on an evening in late June, rolling across the countryside with a violence that seemed personal, wind lashing rain against the windows, and thunder shaking the ancient stones of Ashmore Hall, and Catherine had retired early, with a book she could not concentrate on, startling when her chamber door opened without warning to reveal the Duke standing in the doorway, his hair dishevelled and his usually immaculate cravat loosened, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing heavily as though he had run up the stairs, before he seemed to collect himself and said, with an attempt at his usual formality that was betrayed by the tremor in his voice, "I wish to ensure that the storm had not distressed you, that you and the child were well," and Catherine saw in his face something raw and unguarded, fear that seemed disproportionate to the situation, concern that could not be entirely explained by worry for his heir, and she said softly, "We are well, Your Grace, truly," and for a moment that stretched between them like silk pulled taut, he remained there, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, before he bowed slightly and retreated, leaving her alone with the storm and the dangerous, impossible hope that perhaps his concern was not entirely for the child after all. The man Catherine glimpsed in unguarded moments bore so little resemblance to the cold stranger she had married that she began to wonder whether she had ever truly seen him at all. whether the Duke's careful formality was not his nature, but rather armor. Dom so long ago he had forgotten what it protected, and this understanding came not through any single revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small moments that summer brought, like offerings laid at her feet, each one a piece of a puzzle she had not known she was assembling. She witnessed a smile one afternoon in the library when he thought himself unobserved, a genuine expression of pleasure as he ran his fingers along the spines of newly acquired books, the volumes she recognized as having been sold months earlier to meet some pressing debt, and the joy on his face at their return was so unguarded, so utterly different from his usual reserve, that Catherine felt as though she was seeing something forbidden, a private moment of happiness that illuminated how rarely such moments came to him. His hand steadying her on the stairs became familiar through July as her balance shifted with the child's growth, and where another man might have offered such assistance with casual courtesy, the Duke's touch carried a gentleness that seemed to contradict his careful distance in all other matters, his fingers warm through the fabric of her sleeve, his other hand hovering near her back, as though he could not quite trust that she was steady, could not quite bear to withdraw his support, even after the danger of stumbling had passed, and Catherine found herself inventing reasons to use those particular stairs, drawn to these brief moments of contact, like a starving woman to sustenance. The servant spoke of him with a reverence that puzzled her, until Mrs. Hendricks, emboldened perhaps by Catherine's obvious loneliness, began to share fragments of history during their morning consultations about household matters and stories of how the previous Duke had been a man of magnificent appetites and catastrophic judgment, who had gambled away 3 generations of careful stewardship in less than a decade, and how the current Duke had been barely 20 when he inherited a title synonymous with disgrace and debts that would have broken most men, and how he had spent the next 8 years sacrificing everything, his pride and his youth, even his prospects for a marriage based on affection, to restore what his father had destroyed, selling off treasures piece by piece, dismissing staff he had known since childhood, living with austerity that bordered on deprivation, while he slowly, painfully, rebuilt the estate's reputation and resources. These revelations cast his marriage to her in a different light, transforming what Catherine had understood as mercenary pragmatism into something more complex, the final sacrifice in a long series of surrenders, and she began to wonder whether his distance stemmed not from indifference but from shame, whether he held himself apart not because he did not care, but because he believed himself unworthy of being cared for, a man who had sold himself to save his family's legacy, and could not forgive himself for the transaction, even as he honored its terms with scrupulous attention to her comfort and welfare. Catherine's heart, which she had guarded so carefully against the pain of loving someone who married her for money rather than feeling, began its dangerous work, despite all her efforts to prevent it, hope taking root in the small kindnesses and unguarded moments, and she found herself caught between the wisdom of self-protection and the terrible, compelling possibility that perhaps the Duke's coldness was not rejection, but rather the desperate restraint of a man who believed he had no right to warmth, no claim to affection beyond what duty demanded, and she did not know which would hurt more, to continue believing herself unloved, or to hope that beneath his careful distance lay feelings he would never permit himself to express. The evening arrived with that peculiar golden quality late summer sometimes offers as compensation for its impending departure, the sun hanging low over Ashmore's gardens and casting long shadows across the rose beds where Catherine had taken to walking in the cooler hours, finding solace among the blooms that asked nothing of her except admiration, and she was examining a particularly lovely specimen, pale pink petals edged with deeper rose, when she became aware of the Duke's presence behind her, his approach so quiet she might not have noticed had the evening birds not suddenly ceased their singing, and when she turned she found him standing at the garden gate with an expression she could not decipher, and something between resolve and resignation, and he said, his voice carrying an odd formality even in this informal setting, "Might I join you, Catherine?" using her given name so rarely that the sound of it from his lips made her breath catch, and she nodded, unable to trust her voice, watching as he approached with that careful grace he brought to all his movements, though she noticed a tension in his shoulders that spoke of some internal struggle, and for several moments they stood together in silence, ostensibly admiring the roses, though Catherine was acutely conscious of every breath he took, every small shift of his weight, the way his hands clasped behind his back as though he did not trust them otherwise, until she found herself speaking words she had not planned to say, had not even known she was thinking until they emerged. "You are unhappy, Your Grace. I have seen it in your face when you believe yourself unobserved, and I wonder whether it is the arrangement between us that causes you such evident distress, whether my presence here is a daily reminder of all you were forced to sacrifice." And the moment the words left her lips, she wished them back, terrified of what his answer might reveal, yet unable to continue existing in this state of careful ignorance. And she watched something crack in his carefully maintained composure, his hands falling to his sides and his eyes closing briefly as though gathering strength, and when he spoke his voice was raw with an honesty that seemed to pain him. "You mistake the cause of my unhappiness entirely, though I suppose I have given you no reason to understand the truth, have given you nothing but distance and duty when you deserved." He paused, seeming to struggle with words that came with obvious difficulty. "You speak of sacrifice, but you understand nothing of what I have truly surrendered, nothing of the weight I carry each day knowing that I purchased you like property, that I took a woman of grace and kindness and intelligence and reduced her to a transaction, that I married you for your father's fortune and in doing so forfeited any right to anything beyond what our arrangement stipulated." And Catherine stood frozen, hearing in his words not the confession she had expected, but something far more complex. Layers of shame and self-recrimination that cast his months of distance in an entirely new light. And she said softly, carefully, "You speak of forfeited rights, but I do not understand what you believe you have surrendered beyond what any arranged marriage entails." And he laughed then, a sound utterly without humor, bitter and self-mocking, and said, "I have surrendered the right to hope that you might ever see me as anything other than the man who needed your money badly enough to marry you for it. The right to imagine that your kindness toward me stems from anything but duty or perhaps pity. The right to—" and here his voice dropped so low she had to lean closer to hear, "the right to love you as I have come to do, hopelessly and completely, and with full knowledge that I can never deserve such love returned." And the words hung between them in the golden light, impossible and transformative, and Catherine felt the world tilt and resettle, everything she had understood about their marriage revealing itself as incomplete, and she saw in his face the vulnerability of absolute exposure, the terror of having revealed what he had clearly never intended to confess. And then he was withdrawing, physically and emotionally, stepping back and saying with a desperate attempt at his usual formality, "Forgive me, I should not have spoken so. I have distressed you when you require peace and calm for the child's sake. Please forget my words. I will." But Catherine reached for his hand before he could retreat entirely, her fingers closing around his with a boldness born of sudden understanding. And though she did not yet trust herself to name what she felt, what was blooming in her chest like the roses surrounding them, she held his gaze and said, "Do not ask me to forget what may be the only true words you have ever spoken to me." And they stood there as the sun descended, and the garden grew cool around them, connected by her hand on his, and by the fragile, terrifying possibility that perhaps neither of them was as alone as they had believed. Catherine understood in the days following their encounter in the garden that she had been engaged in a magnificent act of self-deception, telling herself that she remained emotionally uninvested in their marriage, while her heart had been conducting its own quiet rebellion, falling in love with her husband through the accumulated weight of small kindnesses and unguarded moments. And his confession had not created her feelings, but rather illuminated what had been growing in secret, like bulbs planted in darkness that suddenly break through soil into sunlight. And she found herself caught in a peculiar torment of knowing he loved her while believing she could never truly return such feeling. It could never convince him that her love was not born of gratitude or duty, but of genuine affection for the man she had discovered beneath his armor of formality. And the impossibility of bridging this gulf of mutual unworthiness seemed almost cruel in its symmetry. Two people who loved each other yet could not believe themselves worthy of being loved, circling each other like celestial bodies held apart by forces neither could control. She lay awake through long nights wrestling with the knowledge that lived now in her chest, like something with weight and substance, examining it from every angle, as though she might discover some truth she had missed, some way forward through the maze of their misunderstanding. But every path seemed blocked by the original sin of their arrangement, the fact that he had married her for money and she had accepted knowing herself purchased, and how could love built on such foundation ever be trusted? How could either of them believe the other's professed feelings were not somehow distorted by guilt or obligation, or the simple human need for warmth in proximity? And yet when she recalled the rawness in his voice as he spoke of forfeited rights, the vulnerability in his eyes as he confessed what he clearly never intended to reveal, she could not dismiss his words as anything less than truth, painful and absolute. And this certainty warred with her conviction that he deserved better than a merchant's daughter who brought nothing to their union but gold. That his confession had been born of some temporary weakness he would surely come to regret. Autumn arrived early that year, or perhaps Catherine simply noticed its coming with greater acuity, attuned now to symbolism and metaphor in ways she had not been before, and she watched the garden where he had spoken begin its slow transformation from abundance to rest, the roses dropping petals like tears, the leaves turning colors that seemed almost violent in their beauty, as though nature itself was demonstrating how endings and beginnings existed in perpetual conversation. And she found herself touching the place on her abdomen where the child grew, speaking silently to this life she carried, promising to be enough, to provide enough love to compensate for all the complications and sorrows of the adult world. And she decided with a resolution born of desperation that she would be content with whatever pieces of himself the Duke chose to share, that she would not burden him with her own impossible feelings, that friendship and partnership would be sufficient, even as her traitorous heart insisted otherwise, whispering that perhaps, given time and patience, they might find their way through the labyrinth of shame and unworthiness into something resembling grace, though she did not permit herself to hope too openly, did not dare to imagine a future where love existed without the shadow of their arrangement, darkening every tender moment. And so she moved through the shortening days with this knowledge held close and secret, loving him quietly while he loved her from his own careful distance, two people bound by law and circumstance, and the child growing between them, caught in a tragedy of their own making, unable to bridge the small, impossible space that separated lonely from beloved. The change came on a morning when autumn had fully settled over Ashmore, the air carrying that particular crispness that spoke of summer's absolute surrender, and Catherine woke with a sensation she could not immediately identify, something not quite pain, but a wrongness in her body that made her lie very still, as though stillness itself might prevent whatever was beginning from continuing. And when she rose finally and saw the stain on her nightdress, she understood with a terrible clarity that the thing she had most feared was announcing itself, and her cry brought her lady's maid running, the girl's face draining of color at what she saw, and within the hour the household had transformed from its usual ordered calm into barely suppressed chaos. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, dispatching footmen for the midwife, and then the doctor, when the midwife's expression grew grave, and Catherine found herself confined to bed by forces both physical and authoritative, the pain that had begun as wrongness now sharpening into something with edges and insistence. And through the fog of her mounting fear, she became aware of the Duke's presence, not in her chamber where propriety forbade him, but in the corridor beyond, and she could hear his voice though not his words, the tone of it carrying a barely restrained urgency that might have comforted her had she not been so terrified. And the midwife spoke in soothing platitudes that fooled no one, her capable hands performing examinations while her face revealed what her words concealed, and the doctor, when he arrived, brought with him an air of grave concern that settled over the room like a pall, and he conferred with the midwife in whispers Catherine strained to hear but could not decipher, and all the while the wrongness in her body intensified, and her child, who had been moving with such vigorous life, now ominously still, and she found herself bargaining with God or fate, or whatever force governed such things, promising anything, everything, if only this could be stopped, if only she could return to yesterday when her greatest concern had been the impossible distance between herself and her husband. And she heard through the door the Duke's voice rising in a tone she had never heard from him, demanding to be admitted, demanding to know what was happening, and Mrs. Henderson's firm refusal, followed by his acquiescence, though she could hear his pacing, the steady rhythm of his boots on the corridor floor, like a heartbeat external to her own body, And as the day wore on and the autumn light through her windows turned from gold to grey, the sky darkening with clouds that built themselves into towers of slate and iron, and the wind began to rise, pressing against the old windows until they rattled in their frames, and the first drops of rain struck the glass like accusations, and Catherine understood that nature itself was reflecting the catastrophe unfolding within her body, the storm gathering outside mirroring the one tearing through her flesh, and she could hear the servants moving through the house with hushed urgency, their whispers carrying through walls that seemed suddenly thin as paper, and still the Duke paced beyond her door, his vigil unbroken, and once when she cried out he tried again to enter, and she heard the doctor's stern refusal, and then his voice, ragged with something that might have been anguish, saying, "Tell her I am here, tell her I am not leaving." And the words reached her through her fear and pain like a lifeline thrown across dark water, and she held to them as the storm outside intensified, and the crisis within her body moved toward its inevitable conclusion. The loss came with the thunder, or perhaps that is only how Catherine would remember it afterward, the way memory conflates the physical and the metaphorical until they become indistinguishable, but in the moment there was only pain that transcended anything she had imagined possible, a tearing sensation that seemed to split not just her body, but her very conception of herself, and through the roaring in her ears she heard voices speaking in tones that communicated what words could not, the midwife's murmured prayers, the doctor's terse instructions, and somewhere beyond the door the Duke's voice raised in something between demand and supplication, and then the pain reached a crescendo that dragged from her throat a sound she did not recognize as her own, and in the awful quiet that followed, she knew with certainty that transcended explanation that the life she had carried was no longer viable, that the child she had loved and feared for and built her hopes upon had slipped beyond the veil that separates being from unbeing, and the doctor's pronouncement when it came was merely confirmation of what her body had already told her. The formal words, "I am deeply sorry, Your Grace," and the child could not be saved, falling into the room like stones into still water, and Catherine heard herself making a sound that was neither word nor scream, but something more primitive, the keen of grief that lives in the oldest parts of human consciousness. And through the haze of her anguish, she was dimly aware of commotion beyond her chamber door, the Duke's voice brooking no refusal, and then he was there, despite all propriety and protocol, pushing past the doctor's protests to reach her bedside, and she saw his face stripped of every careful mask he had ever worn, saw the devastation written there in lines and shadows, and she tried to form words, to apologize, to beg forgiveness for failing in the one purpose that had justified her presence in his life. But what emerged was only, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I could not," and her voice broke on the impossibility of articulating the magnitude of her failure, and the Duke stood frozen beside her bed, as though turned to stone, his eyes moving between her face and the midwife who was attending to the terrible aftermath of loss, and Catherine saw him register the reality of what had occurred, saw something in him crack and splinter, and when he finally moved it was to sink into the chair beside her bed with a heaviness that suggested his legs would no longer support him, and the room emptied slowly as the doctor and midwife completed their necessary ministrations, their voices gentle with sympathy that felt like sandpaper against Catherine's exposed nerves, and then she and the Duke were alone with their grief and the ghost of what might have been, and Catherine turned her face toward the window where the storm raged with undiminished fury, lightning illuminating the room in stark flashes that rendered everything in absolute contrasts of light and shadow, and she thought of the nursery they had prepared together, the small clothes folded in drawers, the cradle that would remain forever empty. And fresh tears came, though she had believed herself incapable of producing more, and she whispered again into the darkness, punctuated by thunder, "Forgive me. I have failed you. I have failed in everything," her words barely audible but carrying in them the weight of absolute desolation, the certainty that she had lost not only the child but any claim to her husband's regard. And the Duke sat motionless beside her, his silence more terrible than any recrimination could have been. Catherine woke in the grey light of dawn to find the Duke still in the chair beside her bed, his evening clothes rumpled, his cravat loosened, his face bearing the marks of a sleepless night, and she realized with dull surprise that he had not left her chamber at all, that he had maintained his vigil through the entire dark hours, while she had drifted in and out of fevered sleep, haunted by dreams of empty cradles and accusatory silence, and when he saw her eyes open, he leaned forward with an intensity that startled her, asking after her pain, her needs, summoning her maid with a peremptory gesture that sent the girl scurrying to fetch water and fresh linens. And through the days that followed, as her body began its slow physical recovery, while her spirit remained shattered, the Duke did not leave except when propriety absolutely demanded it, and even then he stationed himself in the adjacent sitting room where she could hear him pacing, a caged restlessness that spoke of torments she could not fathom, and when she tried to apologize again, the words tumbling from her in broken fragments about her failure and unworthiness, he cut her off with a sharpness that was almost violence, saying, "You will not speak so, I forbid it," his voice raw with something she could not identify, and she retreated into confused silence, unable to reconcile his presence with what she had expected, which was abandonment, or at best the cold fulfillment of duty. And as the second day became the third and then the fourth, his devoted attendance continued unabated, and she found herself watching him with bewildered incomprehension, this man who read to her from books he somehow knew she loved, who held the cup while she drank because her hands trembled too badly to manage it herself, who dismissed the servants so he might tend to her comfort with his own hands, in gestures that defied every convention of rank and propriety, and finally on the fifth day, when her strength had returned enough for coherent thought if not for hope, she gathered her courage and spoke the truth that had been growing in her mind like a terrible certainty, saying, "You should send me away. I have proven myself unequal to the purpose for which you married me. I cannot give you the heir you require." And she watched his face as she spoke, watched for the relief or agreement that would confirm her worthlessness. But instead, she saw his expression transform into something almost savage, and he rose from his chair with such abruptness that it scraped against the floor, and he moved to the window where he stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid, his hands gripping the windowsill until his knuckles whitened. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so thick with emotion that she barely recognized it as his, and he said, "You believe that is what I want. You believe that is what matters to me." And he turned to face her then, and she saw in his eyes something she had never seen before, a nakedness of feeling that stripped away every careful defense, and he said with a fierceness that seemed torn from somewhere deep within him, "I care nothing for the heir. Do you understand me? Nothing. When I thought I might lose you, when I stood outside that door listening to your suffering and could do nothing, I would have traded this estate, this title, everything I possess, for your safety." And Catherine stared at him in absolute incomprehension, unable to process words that contradicted everything she had believed about their arrangement, about his feelings, about her place in his life. And she whispered, "I do not understand," and saw something like anguish cross his features as he moved back to her bedside and sank into the chair, as though his legs would no longer support him. And he said more quietly, but with no less intensity, "No, I see that you do not, and perhaps that is my failure, that I have hidden myself so well you cannot see what has become so devastatingly clear to me." Catherine lay against her pillows, watching him with eyes that still held the glazed quality of grief and exhaustion, and she said with the terrible honesty that comes when one has lost everything and therefore has nothing left to protect, "You need not pretend such concern. I understand the nature of our arrangement. I have always understood it, and I release you from any obligation to feign emotions you do not feel." And she saw him flinch, as though she had struck him, saw something in his expression that looked almost like pain, and he rose abruptly and moved to the window again as though he could not bear to face her while speaking. And when his words came, they were low and rough, scraped raw by emotion he no longer attempted to contain, and he said, "You understand nothing, Catherine, nothing at all, and that is my fault, my failure, because I have been a coward who hid behind duty and propriety, when the truth is that somewhere between the spring, when you told me of the child, and the summer when we walked in the gardens, everything changed for me. Duty became something else entirely, became devotion, became a feeling I had no right to claim and did not know how to express." And Catherine felt her heart begin to pound with a painful intensity, felt the careful walls she had built around her hope beginning to crack. But she could not allow herself to believe, could not survive the devastation of misunderstanding him. And she whispered, "What are you saying?" and he turned from the window to face her, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. This man who had seemed carved from marble when first she met him, and he said, "I am saying that when I stood outside that door listening to you suffer, when the doctor emerged with his grave face and I thought for one terrible moment that he would tell me you were gone, I knew with absolute clarity that losing the child was not what terrified me. It was losing you, Catherine, you. And I realized then what I had been too blind or too stubborn to admit before, which is that I love you. I love you with an intensity that unmakes me, that renders every careful defense I ever constructed utterly meaningless." And the words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Catherine had believed about their marriage, about his feelings, about her place in his life, and she heard herself make a sound that was half laugh and half sob, disbelief and desperate hope warring within her, and she said, "But you married me for my dowry, for the estate. You needed an heir. You never wanted." And he crossed to her bedside in 3 swift strides and sank to his knees beside her bed, with a lack of regard for dignity that spoke more clearly than any words could. And he took her hand in both of his, and she felt the tremor in his fingers, and he said, "Yes, I married you for those reasons. I will not lie about our beginning. But Catherine, listen to me. Hear what I am telling you, that somewhere in the months of our marriage, I fell in love with my wife, truly and completely, and I believed myself unworthy of your love in return. Believed you could never feel anything but obligation toward a man who had purchased you so mercenarily, and so I tried to content myself with whatever pieces of yourself you might offer. Tried to hide the magnitude of what I felt, because I had no right to burden you with it." And Catherine stared at him through tears that blurred his features into soft edges, and she felt something breaking open in her chest, something that was not pain but its opposite, the terrible, beautiful ache of hope vindicated, and she whispered, "You love me?" Making it a question because she needed to hear him say it again, needed the confirmation that this was not fever dream or wishful imagining, and he said with fierce certainty, "I love you, Catherine. I love you more than this estate, more than any title or heir, more than my own life, and losing our child breaks my heart, but losing you would have destroyed me entirely." The days that followed became a period of healing unlike anything Catherine had imagined possible, for the Duke did not retreat behind his formal walls once his confession had been made, but instead remained constantly at her side, a presence both tender and unwavering, and she found herself learning the man she had married as though meeting him for the first time, discovering in their long conversations the depths he had kept hidden behind duty's mask, and he read to her in the afternoons when her strength was still too depleted for much activity, his voice transforming poetry and prose into something intimate. And when nightmares came in the dark hours, dreams of blood and loss and empty cradles that jerked her awake, with her heart pounding and tears streaming down her face, he was there to hold her, to whisper reassurances against her hair, to share his own grief over the child they had lost, and she realized with wonder that he mourned not merely an heir but their baby, the life they had imagined, the future that had been stolen, and in sharing their sorrow rather than bearing it in isolation, something shifted between them, a deepening that transcended even the love they had confessed, and as Catherine's physical strength gradually returned through the passing weeks, they took short walks together through the estate grounds, and he spoke to her of things he had never shared before, his father's profligacy and the crushing burden of inherited debt, his determination to restore what had been squandered, his shame at needing her fortune, his fear that she would always see him as the man who had purchased her. And Catherine listened with a heart that ached for all the loneliness he had endured, and she told him of her own journey, how she had fallen in love with glimpses and gestures, how she had believed herself unloved and unlovable beyond her monetary value, and they marveled together at the parallel paths they had walked, each loving in secret, each convinced of their own unworthiness, and gradually through these conversations deep into the night, when the household slept, and they sat together before the fire in her sitting room, Catherine felt something inside her that had broken beginning to knit back together, not into what it had been before, but into something different, something stronger for having been shattered and remade, and the Duke seemed similarly transformed, the rigid formality that had defined him, giving way to expressions of tenderness that grew more natural with practice, the tentative touch of his hand on hers becoming familiar, the way he looked at her shifting from careful guardedness to open devotion, and there were small intimacies that rebuilt hope between them. The morning he brought her breakfast himself and stayed to share it. The afternoon she found him weeping silently in the nursery. They had prepared and went to him without words, simply holding him while he held her. The evening he kissed her forehead, and then her lips with a gentleness that spoke of reverence rather than mere desire. And through all of it, Catherine felt herself emerging from grief, not into forgetfulness, but into a place where sorrow and love could coexist, where loss did not negate hope, and she saw the same transformation in her husband, this man who had revealed himself to be so much more than the cold duke she had married. And as autumn deepened toward winter, and the trees shed their leaves in preparation for dormancy and renewal, Catherine and the Duke moved through their shared healing day by day, building something real and lasting from the ashes of tragedy. Winter arrived at Ashmore Hall not with the bitter desolation that had marked Catherine's first months as Duchess, but with a quality of crystalline beauty that seemed to reflect the transformation occurring within the estate's walls. For as snow blanketed the grounds and ice traced delicate patterns on the windows, the relationship between Catherine and her husband underwent its own metamorphosis, the rigid formality that had once defined every interaction between them dissolving like frost in morning sun, replaced by something genuine and sustaining, a partnership built not on duty but on mutual devotion, tested by fire and proven true. And one morning in early December, the Duke appeared at Catherine's sitting room with an armful of leather-bound ledgers, setting them on the table before her with an expression that mingled nervousness and determination. And when she looked at him questioningly, he said, "These are the estate accounts, all of them, every debt and asset and calculation, and I want you to see them, to understand fully what we face, because you are not merely my wife, but my partner, Catherine, and I will hide nothing from you anymore." And she felt tears prick her eyes at this gesture of trust, at being invited into the masculine sphere of finance and estate management that wives were typically shielded from. And together they spent long afternoons going through the figures, and the Duke explaining his strategies for restoration, while Catherine, whose merchant father had educated her in matters of business, despite society's disapproval, offered insights that sometimes surprised him and always delighted him. And gradually through these sessions Catherine came to understand not only the magnitude of what her dowry had saved, but also the intelligence and dedication with which her husband had worked to rebuild what his father had destroyed. And she felt a fierce pride in him, this man who had carried such burdens alone for so long. And there were other changes too, small moments that accumulated into a larger pattern of transformation. Like the evening she heard laughter echo through the great hall, and realized with shock that it was her own voice mingling with his, that somehow joy had found its way back into rooms that had known only silence and sorrow, and their dinners became occasions for genuine conversation rather than dutiful ritual. The Duke telling her stories from his childhood that revealed the boy he had been before responsibility had hardened him, Catherine sharing memories of her own youth and dreams she had harbored before accepting that she would be married for advantage rather than affection. And sometimes after dinner they would sit together in the library, she with her embroidery and he with his correspondence, and the silence between them was no longer awkward but companionable, the quiet of two people completely at ease in each other's presence. And at night, when he came to her chamber, it was not from obligation but from desire, a tenderness between them now that transformed physical intimacy into something sacred, an expression of the love they had finally acknowledged. And Catherine marveled at how grief, which might have destroyed them, had instead become the forge in which their marriage had been transformed, from transaction into truth, from arrangement into devotion. And as winter deepened and the year drew toward its close, she understood with profound gratitude that she and her husband were not merely surviving their loss, but discovering in its aftermath a depth of connection she had never imagined possible. Spring returned to Ashmore Hall with a gentleness that seemed purposeful, as though nature itself understood that this season carried particular significance for those dwelling within the estate's walls. And Catherine woke one morning in late March to find her husband already awake beside her, watching her with an expression of such tender devotion that her breath caught, and when she asked what he was thinking, he said simply, "That I am grateful for every morning I wake to find you here." And she understood that he too felt the symbolic weight of spring's arrival, this season that had once brought hope in the form of new life only to end in devastation. And yet now they faced it together, transformed by all they had endured and overcome, and as the days lengthened and warmth returned to the land, Catherine and the Duke spent long hours in conversation about their future, discussions that would have been unthinkable in the early months of their marriage, when duty had defined every interaction. And one afternoon, as they walked through the estate gardens, where crocuses pushed through the last remnants of snow, the Duke stopped suddenly and turned to face her with unusual solemnity, and he said, "Catherine, I need you to understand something with absolute certainty. You are enough. You have always been enough. And whether we are ever blessed with children or not, my love for you is not contingent upon heirs or duty or any purpose beyond the simple fact that you are you." And she felt tears spring to her eyes at this declaration, at the freedom it offered from the weight of expectation she had carried since accepting his proposal, and she replied that she loved him not for his title or his estate, but for the man he had revealed himself to be, and the person behind the formal mask he had worn for so long. And they stood there among the spring flowers, holding each other while the world renewed itself around them. And in that moment, Catherine felt something shift inside her, a final releasing of the fear and shame that had lingered since the loss of their child, and she understood that they had built something real and lasting from the ashes of tragedy, that their marriage had been transformed from transaction into truth, from arrangement into the deepest devotion. And later that week the Duke suggested they plant something in the garden as a memorial to what they had lost, and together they chose forget-me-nots for their delicate beauty and symbolic meaning. And on a mild afternoon, with clouds drifting across a pale blue sky, they knelt together in the earth, their hands working side by side to create a small garden in a quiet corner near the old oak tree. And as they worked, the Duke spoke of grief and memory, of honoring loss without being defined by it, of carrying sorrow alongside joy rather than allowing it to eclipse all light. And Catherine added her own reflections about how tragedy had unexpectedly become the catalyst for their transformation, how the worst moment of her life had paradoxically led to the deepest connection she had ever known. And when the forget-me-nots were planted, they sat together in the grass, despite the impropriety of a duke and duchess sitting on the ground like common folk, and they made promises to each other about the life they would build, a future focused not on duty or heirs or the expectations of society, but on their love and partnership, on creating a home filled with warmth and honesty, and the kind of devotion that survives even the darkest seasons. And as spring settled over Ashmore Hall, bringing with it the eternal promise of renewal, Catherine understood with profound gratitude that she and her husband had been given a precious gift, the opportunity to begin again, not as strangers bound by arrangement, but as partners united by love, tested in fire, and proven unbreakable. Early summer arrived with a profusion of roses and honeysuckle that perfumed the air at Ashmore Hall, and Catherine woke one morning in late June to a sensation both familiar and terrifying, a delicate queasiness that sent her heart racing with recognition, and for several days she said nothing to anyone, observing her body with a mixture of hope so fragile, it hurt, and fear so profound, it threatened to overwhelm her. And she found herself bargaining with fate, promising that if this were true, she would not take a single moment for granted, that she would be grateful rather than anxious, though she knew, even as she made these internal promises, that terror and joy would be inseparable companions through whatever lay ahead. And finally, when she could no longer deny the signs, she sought out her husband in his study, finding him bent over correspondence with the afternoon light streaming through the windows. And when he looked up and saw her expression, he set down his pen immediately, rising to meet her with concern, already shadowing his features, and she said simply, "I believe I am with child again," and watched as comprehension flooded his face, followed not by the satisfaction she had seen the first time, but by something closer to fear, a tightening around his eyes that told her he too remembered what had been lost. And he crossed to her in 3 strides and took her hands in his. And his first words were not about heirs or duty, but a question delivered with almost desperate intensity. "How do you feel? Are you well? Has the doctor been summoned?" And she felt tears spring to her eyes at his concern, at the way his first thought was for her rather than the child she carried. And she assured him she was well, that it was early yet, that she had wanted to tell him before involving physicians or making preparations. And he pulled her into his arms with a tenderness that still had the power to surprise her, despite all they had shared, and against her hair he whispered, "Catherine, you must understand if we are forced to choose. If there is any danger to you, there is no choice at all. You are what matters, not an heir, not a dynasty, you." And she felt something inside her chest expand at this declaration, at the absolute certainty in his voice, and she drew back to look at him and saw tears on his cheeks matching her own, and she said, "I am frightened," and he replied, "So am I, terrified beyond measure. But we will face this together, whatever comes. And I need you to promise me that you will not suffer in silence or hide your fears or pretend strength you do not feel, because we are partners now, Catherine, in truth and not merely in name." And she promised, and in the days that followed his devotion manifested in countless protective gestures that might have felt suffocating if they had not been so clearly rooted in love rather than possession, the way he insisted she rest more than was probably necessary, how he appeared at odd hours simply to assure himself of her well-being, his habit of reaching for her hand whenever they were together, as though he needed the physical confirmation of her presence. And Catherine found herself determined that this time would be different, that they would not let fear steal the joy of these months, that they would face whatever came with honesty and courage, rather than the dutiful silence that had characterized her first pregnancy. And so when terror woke her at night, she told him rather than hiding it. And when he confessed his own fears, she held him and reminded him that they were stronger together than apart, and gradually through this mutual vulnerability and honest sharing of both hope and fear, Catherine began to believe that perhaps this time, wrapped in love rather than duty, surrounded by devotion rather than isolation, they might find their way through to the happiness that had once seemed impossible, and early summer deepened into full bloom around them, while within her another life began its precarious journey toward existence. The months that followed unfolded with a quality entirely different from Catherine's first pregnancy, and where before she had navigated the experience in dutiful isolation, now she moved through each day wrapped in her husband's unwavering devotion, and the Duke's presence became a constant reassurance in the way he would appear in whatever room she occupied, as though drawn by invisible threads, how his hand would find hers during their evening walks through the gardens, and the tender concern in his voice when he asked about her well-being that clearly sought honest answers rather than polite reassurances. And Catherine found strength she had not known she possessed in this partnership, in the knowledge that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together without pretense or protective distance. And as summer deepened into its fullest expression of life and abundance, they made practical preparations for the child's arrival. But these preparations were tempered with emotional honesty about the risks they both understood too well. And one evening in late July, as they sat together in what would be the nursery, the Duke spoke with unusual directness about his fears, confessing that he woke some nights in terror at the thought of losing her, that no heir could ever compensate for such a loss, and Catherine responded with equal honesty that she too carried fear alongside hope, that she thought often of what had been lost but refused to let that memory steal the grace of the present moment, and in this mutual vulnerability their bond deepened into something that transcended even love, becoming a partnership forged through shared joy and shared sorrow, through the understanding that life offered no guarantees, but that facing uncertainty together was infinitely better than facing it alone. And when August arrived with its heavy heat and long twilights, Catherine noticed the subtle changes in her body with gratitude rather than the anxious monitoring that had characterized her first pregnancy, and she felt the first flutters of movement with wonder that she immediately shared with her husband, taking his hand and placing it against her stomach so he too could feel the evidence of life within her, and she watched tears gather in his eyes at this tangible proof of their child, at the miracle and terror of new life. And as the weeks passed, they fell into rhythms of care and connection, morning walks where they spoke of everything and nothing, afternoons when he would read to her while she rested, evenings spent in quiet companionship that required no words, and gradually as summer began its slow transition toward autumn, Catherine felt a shift in her own relationship with fear, understanding that she could not control what would come, but that she could choose how she moved through these months, and she chose hope over anxiety, presence over worry, trust over the illusion of protective detachment. And when the first cool winds of September began to blow through Ashmore Hall, carrying with them the scent of turning leaves and the promise of autumn's arrival, Catherine felt her body tense with memory, remembering too well what had happened when autumn came before. But this time, when she confessed these fears to her husband, he held her close and reminded her that they were not the same people they had been a year ago, that they had been transformed by loss and love, and together they made the conscious decision to honor the approaching season, not with dread, but with acknowledgement that autumn could bring both endings and continuations, that the same season that had witnessed their greatest sorrow might yet witness their greatest joy. And as October arrived with its pageant of color and its crisp mornings and golden afternoons, Catherine and the Duke faced each day with courage drawn from their love, with hope tempered by realism, with the profound understanding that whatever lay ahead they would meet it, not as Duke and Duchess bound by arrangement, but as partners united by devotion tested in fire and proven unbreakable. Late October arrived with mist clinging to the grounds of Ashmore Hall and the last leaves falling from the ancient oaks, and Catherine woke in the early hours of a grey dawn to the unmistakable sensation of labour beginning, a tightening across her belly that sent both anticipation and terror coursing through her veins. And she lay still for several moments, breathing through the contraction, while beside her the Duke slept with one hand resting protectively on her hip, as had become his habit, and when the sensation passed, she gently touched his shoulder, saying his name quietly into the pre-dawn darkness, and he woke instantly with the alertness of someone who had been sleeping lightly, his eyes finding hers immediately as he asked, "Is it time?" And she nodded, watching as he rose swiftly to summon the midwife and doctor, to alert the household staff. And within the hour, her chamber had been transformed into a place of purposeful activity, but through it all the Duke remained at her side despite the midwife's suggestions that he might be more comfortable elsewhere, and he held Catherine's hand through each contraction, his presence an anchor as the hours stretched long and the labor intensified, and there were moments when fear threatened to overwhelm her, when the memories of loss crashed over her like waves, and she gripped his hand with desperate strength, and during these moments he would lean close and remind her to breathe, would tell her she was strong, would promise that whatever happened he was with her and would not leave. And the day passed in a timeless haze of pain and effort, the grey light beyond the windows deepening into afternoon and then evening, and still the Duke remained, his cravat long discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled back, his face lined with concern and exhaustion that mirrored her own, and the midwife pronounced that things were progressing well, that Catherine was strong, that soon they would meet their child. And as full darkness fell beyond the windows and candles were lit throughout the chamber, Catherine felt the urgent need to push, and the Duke supported her through it, one arm around her shoulders, his voice in her ear providing encouragement and love. And when finally, after one last tremendous effort, she heard the thin, piercing cry of a newborn infant, she collapsed back against her husband's chest, with tears streaming down her face, and the midwife announced with satisfaction, "A daughter, Your Grace, a beautiful, healthy daughter." And Catherine watched through blurred vision as the tiny bundled form was cleaned and wrapped, and then placed in the Duke's arms, and she saw his face transform as he looked down at their child, saw tears spill freely down his cheeks as he examined each tiny feature with wonder, and he whispered, "She is perfect, Catherine, absolutely perfect." And then he was placing the baby carefully in Catherine's arms, and she looked down at the small face, the dark eyes that seemed to look directly at her, the miniature hands that grasped reflexively, and she felt a love so overwhelming it was almost painful. And when she looked up at her husband, she saw the same emotion reflected in his expression, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead with infinite tenderness, saying, "Thank you, my love. Thank you for this gift, for your courage, for surviving, for being here, for everything." And Catherine reached up to touch his face, her own tears mingling with his, and she replied, "We did this together." And as the household staff quietly celebrated below, and the midwife went about her final ministrations, and their daughter slept peacefully between them, Catherine and the Duke sat together in the candle-lit chamber, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of gratitude and joy and relief, knowing that they had been given a grace they would never take for granted, that from sorrow had come this perfect joy, that their love had been tested and proven unbreakable, and outside the window the mist lifted and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky like promises of hope fulfilled. 2 years passed like a dream gradually remembered upon waking, and Ashmore Hall in early spring bore almost no resemblance to the cold, crumbling estate that Catherine had first entered as a nervous bride, for now sunlight seemed to fill every corridor, flowers bloomed in vases on tables that had once stood bare, and the sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had known only silence for so many years. And on a bright April morning, Catherine stood in the nursery doorway, watching her husband sit on the floor with their daughter Eleanor, the child's dark curls bouncing as she toddled unsteadily between the Duke's outstretched hands. And each time Eleanor reached him, he would sweep her up with exaggerated celebration that sent peals of delighted laughter cascading through the room, and Catherine felt her hand rest unconsciously on her belly, where new life quickened once more. This third pregnancy, carrying none of the terror of the second and none of the lonely isolation of the first, but instead unfolding with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew herself loved beyond measure. And the Duke looked up and caught her watching, and the smile he gave her held such warmth and devotion that even after 2 years of his open affection, she still felt her breath catch. And he said, "Come join us, my love. Eleanor has nearly mastered walking and insists on demonstrating for her mother." And Catherine crossed the room that had once stood empty and grief-haunted but now overflowed with toys and books and all the beautiful chaos of childhood, and she lowered herself carefully to sit beside her husband, and Eleanor immediately launched herself toward Catherine's lap with the fearless trust of a thoroughly cherished child. And as Catherine gathered her daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, she thought of how impossible this happiness would have seemed during those early months of cold formality, how she could never have imagined that the remote Duke who had married her for her dowry would become this devoted husband and tender father. And later that afternoon, as they walked together through the restored gardens, where forget-me-nots bloomed in a carefully tended corner, Eleanor held between them, with each parent holding one small hand. Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, the sorrow that had broken them open and allowed love to take root in places that duty alone could never have reached. And that evening, after Eleanor had been settled into bed, and they sat together in the drawing-room, where a fire crackled cheerfully, and the account books that the Duke had long ago opened to Catherine's partnership showed an estate restored to prosperity through their combined efforts, he took her hand and said, "I never thanked you properly for saving me." And Catherine looked at him with surprise, asking what he meant, and he replied, "You saved me from a life of isolation and duty, from the cold fortress I had built around my heart, from the belief that I was unworthy of love, and you did it simply by being who you are, by your courage and grace, and willingness to see past my defenses to the man I was too afraid to reveal." And Catherine felt tears gather as she responded, "We saved each other, my love, for I was equally lost before I found you, before I learned that the deepest love often grows in the most unlikely soil, watered by tears as much as joy." And as night deepened around Ashmore Hall and their daughter slept peacefully in her nursery, a new life stirred beneath Catherine's heart. They sat together in perfect contentment, two people who had begun as strangers in a mercenary arrangement and had become partners in the truest sense, their love forged through patience and tested by sorrow, and emerging stronger and more beautiful than either had dreamed possible. The years continued to unfold with the gentle grace of seasons turning, and Catherine and the Duke grew old together at Ashmore Hall, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren, their love deepening with each passing year into something so fundamental it became as necessary as breathing. And on quiet evenings they would sometimes walk through the restored gardens and pause by the forget-me-nots that returned faithfully each spring, remembering the child they had lost and acknowledging how that grief had cracked them open in ways that allowed true intimacy to take root. And it was during one such evening as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold that Catherine turned to her husband and said, "I would not change a single moment of our journey, not even the darkest parts, for they made us who we are." And he had squeezed her hand in silent agreement, both of them understanding that the most profound transformations often occur in the crucible of shared sorrow. Dear listener, perhaps you find yourself in circumstances that seem barren of hope. Perhaps you face arrangements of necessity rather than choice. Perhaps you have known loss that makes you question whether joy will ever return. And if so, then let this story be a gentle reminder that love often arrives not with trumpets and fanfare, but in the accumulated small moments of choosing to remain present, choosing to see beyond surfaces, choosing to risk vulnerability even when every instinct urges protection. The deepest connections are rarely formed in perfect circumstances, but rather in the messy, difficult spaces where two people decide that despite everything, despite disappointment and grief and fear, they will show up for each other with honesty and courage. Catherine and the Duke's love did not erase their sorrow or make their losses somehow worthwhile, for grief is not something to be transcended or traded away, but their willingness to grieve together and to hold each other through the darkness without demanding that either pretend to be stronger than they felt created a foundation more solid than any built on easier ground. So if you find yourself in a season of waiting, in relationships that feel more transactional than tender, in circumstances that seem designed to break rather than build you, do not despair completely, for you cannot know what transformations time and patience and honest presence might work. You cannot predict when duty might soften into devotion, or when the person you thought you knew might reveal depths that take your breath away. Give yourself permission to hope cautiously, to take small risks, to show fragments of your true self even when you are afraid, and give others the grace to do the same. For we are all carrying burdens invisible to outside eyes, all protecting wounds we fear might never heal, all longing for connection while terrified of the vulnerability it requires. May you find the courage to remain open to unexpected grace. May you discover that the most beautiful things often grow in unlikely soil. May you learn that being truly seen in your weakness is worth more than being admired for false strength. And may you know the particular peace that comes from being loved, not despite your flaws, but as a whole person, complexity and contradiction and all. May your nights be filled with rest earned through honest living. May your days hold moments of connection that remind you why courage matters. And may you always remember that transformation, when it comes, arrives quietly through 1,000 small choices, to love anyway, to stay anyway, to hope anyway, even when the outcome remains uncertain. This has been a story from Calm Chronicles, and if these words brought you comfort or contemplation, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories of transformation and hope, and share your thoughts in the comments below. For your reflections add to the collective wisdom we build together, and may you sleep well knowing that the best chapters of your own story may yet be unwritten.